Welcome to the podcast, the Social World podcast. I'm Dave Niven and it's good to have your company. Now, today I'm going to let you listen to an interview I did with Professor Harry Ferguson from Nottingham University. The interview was conducted live at the BASPCAN Congress in Edinburgh at the university there. And it's a fascinating opportunity to listen to Harry's thoughts on child protection and, if you like, the performance of social workers in practice. He actually became embedded with a team of social workers and used that as some very good research. And he observed them interacting with children in families. And some of his conclusions are fascinating and provocative and very helpful in a learning experience. So I'd like you to listen to Harry's thoughts, and I'd like you to respond to them if you could. Remember, you can, to me here, do it on SpeakPipe or do it through Twitter at Dave Niven, or iTunes. You can download this podcast from iTunes or Podfeed or Stitcher, any of these platforms. But just give us some feedback. It's always good to hear from you. Now, as I said, the interview was conducted live at the Congress, so, there's, as you would expect, some background noise, but it's all perfectly good stuff. And Harry Ferguson is an old friend of the programme, so I assure you it's good listening. Here you go. Welcome, Harry.
Thanks, David.
So what are you presenting here at Congress?
I'm giving a paper this morning, which is based on my research where I've observed social workers in their practice, in how they interact with children and families, mainly on home visits. And that study generated a lot of data, some of which was extremely positive in terms of, revealing very, very skilled, knowledgeable, effective social work practice with children and parents. But there were a relatively small number of cases that I observed where the social workers didn't engage with the children. And so what I'm exploring in my presentation today is how children become invisible in child protection work.
I know from before talking with you about earlier stages of this research where you really did feel that social workers had lost track a bit in terms of talking with children and in terms of prioritising the importance of talking to children. Is that still a fair point?
Well, I think the way that we need to think about this, or this is what I'm going to argue anyway, is I think there's a tendency to, listeners will be very familiar with this, there's a tendency to blame the individual practitioner when things go wrong. I mean, you only have to think of Peter Conley and the appalling treatment of the practitioners and the managers in that case, and the persecution from the media and so on. So there's this kind of tendency to individualize and blame social workers for bad practice and so on. In the cases that I observed where social workers didn't effectively communicate with children, or even in a very small number didn't even acknowledge the children when they were in the same room as them, what I'm going to be arguing is that we need to look at why this happens in a broad kind of systemic context. So in these scenarios, what I've tried to do is look at, what was going on in the organisation, what was the workers' experience in terms of what kind of preparation did they get from their team managers, before they left the office, in terms of getting focused on what's the best way to deal with this referral, this case, how did they manage the journey from the office? Because one of the things I found in my research, in going out with social workers, I would interview them in their cars. it was usually in their car. Sometimes they walked to visits, but I would always interview them on the way there. And, this sounds obvious in a way, but I don't think we acknowledge it enough. And that is that, that sort of space between the office and getting to the child and family home, is an important space for reflection and sort of getting yourself in the zone, getting yourself kind of focused on what are you going to say, what is your plan. I mean, you should have got help with that from your manager in the office anyway. So that's another stage in the process, and then there's a whole range of things that I found that can happen.
Do you feel that obviously, that there should be possibly more thought put into the preparation time, and that possibly some managers, by implication, aren't thinking enough about preparing their workers before they go out? At the same time, I do remember you talking about the visit itself, and I seem something sticks in my mind, remembering that I think you were saying that social workers, less frequently than they possibly used to now, don't go prepared for work with children by taking maybe even things as simple as crayons and colouring books or anything that would help the child demonstrate how they're feeling.
Yeah.
Is that still fair?
Yeah, I mean, in the research that I've done, the findings have been mixed in relation to that. Some practitioners routinely take toys and paper and pens and Play-Doh and games and so on with them on visits or to families or wherever they're going to see children, but some don't. And so when I began to notice this, I started to explore it in the research, and I said to us, and I started to ask managers, whether how aware they were of it, and some of them weren't very aware of it, because their main preoccupation was, how long, was timescales. The sort of performance indicators that they were working to were the kind of things that we know an awful lot about now and their impact, So there was that. So the whole organisational culture wasn't child play focused enough, really. And so one of the things I would argue is that, in terms of shifting the culture of social work to be more child focused, child friendly, is that we have to kind of, and I've spoken at many events around the country to groups of social workers and managers, and so it's not just my research actually, but the kind of things that I've heard from hundreds of practitioners that I've had the chance to engage with is that some organisations don't provide these things, that workers sort of get stuff together themselves. So there's there's a whole organisational culture that doesn't really facilitate child-centred, creative, playful practice. So it's wrong to simply blame individual workers when they turn up unprepared in that sense to communicate with children, because they have they're not getting any encouragement to do it.
No, would you also say,
or in any training actually as well, David? I would say, because that was another finding of even some of the really good social workers and social workers who were very skilled at working with children felt that they would like more training, more continuous professional development to become even better at it.
Talking to children, listening to children, I totally understand. And I imagine, I'll ask you, but I imagine that you would agree with the fact that one of the distractions these days is that more and more of the actual practitioner function in social work is inspectorial, administrative, and the direct work with children is more drifting towards the voluntary sector. Yeah. Is that a fair point, Steve?
Or family support workers. There's some fantastic work going on by childcare workers, family support workers. But there was some fabulous work going on by social workers as well. But you're right, everything that we know about the impact of bureaucracy, performance management, social workers having to spend long periods of time at their computers. That really ate into the time that they had to work with children. So in the cases that, the way that I've come to think about this is that one of the reasons that children become invisible in child protection work is because of the struggles that exist for social workers in making any children visible in a meaningful sense, in terms of having enough time to devote to establishing relationships. So in my study, typically, relatively short amounts of time was spent with children. Sort of averaged around 15 minutes. Quite often assessments were done on the basis of like 1 15-minute encounter with the child.
I guess you're talking about any age, I guess you're talking about, are you? Who's capable of actually expressing themselves.
That's a very good point, David. The cutoff point was around 4 or 5. I mean, this is an interesting area around like how social workers construct childhood, to use that kind of sociological term. How do they what's their perceptions of age-related kind of capacities for children to be able to have the understanding and articulacy to talk about their experience. And in my research, it tends to be children below the age of 4 tend not to be directly engaged with. And there were, this won't surprise people who are listening to this, who are doing this work every day, but there was a high proportion of young preschool children in the cases in my studies. And so that, for me, again, kind of, reinforces the need for workers to be good, not just at talking to children, but playing with them, communicating with them,
listening,
getting down to their level.
Can I just take it a bit further? Because, I mean, I don't think there's many practitioners who are going to disagree with you about the time and the effort that should be spent, and whether they should be supported, trained more, etc. Take the whole child protection process. Take the process of actually the whole assessment process, the investigative process, and then, sadly, sometimes the legal process or the case conference or the whatever. So many people still keep talking about there's not enough listening to the voice of the child, the actual, hearing the child, listening to the child, whether it's recording the child or representing the child. I mean, that's part of the continuum that you're really focusing on, as I understand it. Is that fair?
Yeah. And I would also add to that, really useful summary, David, that there are issues that we haven't really addressed around where's the best place to talk to children. And one of the reasons I found in my research why sessions with children by social workers, say on home visits, don't last very long is because parents interrupt them. They either walk into the room and end the encounter, or they make noises outside and they let the worker know that it's time, your time's up.
Nerves? Do you think about what the child might be saying?
Oh, of course.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
It's not hard. It's not hard as an adult or parent to imagine how difficult it must be. If you've got a social worker upstairs. Bedrooms were the most popular place where social workers saw children on their own in the home. So how would they feel when their child is upstairs in their bedroom being engaged with by a social worker, inevitably talking about what's going on in the family? So and social workers told me about how anxious they got. This has got organisational implications again, because the more that we move to hot desking and kind of the sort of cutting back on office space that's typical of this contemporary era that we're in, so-called agile working and so on, the less space there is in organisations, the less space there is to do work with children anywhere other than in the home.
Yeah. Well, how about, take you slight tangentially off here a minute, because what we've also got is a huge growing problem about children on social media. And to a large extent, you can argue the voice of the child gets written an awful lot, and their feelings to their friends on the various social media platforms and so forth. Now, you mentioned, interestingly enough, Peter Connolly. And I know for a fact, at least that I've seen 2 reports of this, that the day before Peter died, Tracy Connolly, his mother, was on Facebook posting all sorts of things about her fab new boyfriend and sex and drugs and rock and roll and everything like that. Whereas all the professionals maintained all the way through that they weren't aware of his presence in the house. If, therefore, they had been monitoring Tracy Connolly's social media, there may well have been an opportunity to, well, who knows, but maybe a different outcome, who knows. But the same goes for the child, because we're always telling parents nowadays, monitor your child. Don't, let them go off into their bedroom and get seduced by this, that, and the next thing and groomed and so forth. But at the same time, one can imagine a real valuable source of material information and possibly protective information by monitoring a child's social media. There's a bit of a paradox there, isn't there?
I think the use of social media not only as a source of risk and danger to children, but as a potential resource is something that, you're right, we need to explore much more. There's all sorts of ethical dilemmas, isn't there, about... I mean, it's not ethical. It's pretty clear the BASPCAN sort of social media ethics statement is clear that, it's not ethical for social workers to monitor service users.
But working together instructs us to do essentially what anything we have to in order to prevent abuse, which is that...
Absolutely. But I think it's a similar. It connects to the point we've been talking about play and entering children's worlds, doesn't it? Because that's something that fascinates me and that I've tried to explore in the research I've been doing. Is like, how do workers get? I call it intimate practice. How do they get into the child's world, both in terms of their internal world, come to understand their experience in all its facets, and the need to enter their world in terms of their space, their bedrooms, get a sense of what kind of quality of life they have. Some of the best social work practice I observed, social workers were really good at this. They didn't, social workers routinely inspect home conditions nowadays, which means looking around children's bedrooms, and some will look at parents' bedrooms and all that. But, I think what really struck me was that some practitioners framed this activity not just as an inspection task, but as kind of looking for resources through which that they could communicate with children. So a reason why they used bedrooms a lot was because bedrooms typically had a lot of the child's possessions, like toys, pictures, so they could use those resources creatively to get down to the child's level, enter their imaginations and find out what their experiences are. But doing that requires one of the most valuable commodities around, which is time. And, with the demands of caseloads these days, I suspect one of the most common cries we get from social workers is, well, you alluded to it earlier with the kind of the very short amount of time that social workers tend to speak to, and speaking to children. And, we all know it's a fact that you don't just walk up to a family and say, hi, I'm a social worker, trust me. That takes time. And, you wouldn't say to a surgeon, would you hurry up with that heart operation, please, because, you've got another 10 outside. Come on, get on with it. You just don't do that. There's certain boundaries that some professions are respected for. And I always get so frustrated about the lack of understanding that social workers need time to pursue their profession. Yeah, I think that's right, David. Absolutely, they do need time. And they need time to think about what's happening in their relationships, in their encounters with children and parents and so on. But I would want to insist that in some ways I think the time issue is, we have to be careful we don't overplay it as a problem, because again, one thing I learned from observing practice is that some practitioners were capable of forming very meaningful contacts with children very, very quickly, like within minutes, They were charismatic practitioners, and they were skilled, knowledgeable, and I think one of the things we have to confront is, what is that about? I think we have to look at some what are quite traditional social work concepts, like the use of self, and we got to ask, sort of questions like, well, what is the self that's being used as well? And, I think one of the interesting things that I want to explore further here is like, what relational capacities do individual social workers have?
Well, let me turn it back to you a wee bit, because one of the hats you wear obviously is that you teach at university social workers, in training. I mean, and in effect, and you're talking about interpersonal skills to a large extent, and charisma you mentioned, and so forth. I mean, what do you find when you kind of raise that with them? Because obviously you're going to get a whole variety of humanity wanting to be social workers.
That's right.
Right. Yes, right. And saying, have some more charisma is not really sort of.
And then, and it's like, it's not just about it's not just about charisma in the kind of stereotypical sense of extroverts or something like that. There were. And it's interesting to reflect on what's the right kind of language to use for this, even because there were practitioners who had a kind of a quiet, humble effectiveness. If I've put that, I'm not sure I put that right, but they had a gentle, empathetic, compassionate presence, and they were able to communicate very, very quickly to children. That they were there for them, and children, one of the great privileges of observing this kind of practice is that you can actually witness children believing in them, trusting them. You can see the trust being built from the word go, and so yes, and so I think, and so training and education we need to focus much more on these qualities, on the skills, the kind of one of the things I hope that this research of mine can do is sort of provide just examples of how this is done, so that people can learn from them and engage with them in the sense of reflecting on, how would I do that? Would I do it another way? And so learning from good practice.
Okay, let me take it a little bit further, because I haven't got a current sense of a kind of a universal way that local authorities or employers of social workers now interview, but it used to be fairly common that the interviewing process was 99% competence based, and then there was a bit about get yourself a couple of referees and you're not going to give your worst enemy, and then have a police check which just says you haven't been convicted of anything yet. I've never remembered an interview for social workers that actually said, do you like children?
Yeah.
And that takes me back a bit to when they're with you in the university. Do you think that there's enough screening out?
Well, we are getting more rigorous, David. There's been a lot of talk about the qualification level that's necessary, intellectual ability that's required to be a good social worker, and so I think there's clear expectations and requirements around having like our MA at Nottingham is all 2-1 students. Our graduates all have to have 2-1s, and I think that's going to be rolled out as an expectation over the next few years. And we're also becoming much more rigorous in sort of profiling psychologically and so on applicants for courses.
Much more than it used to be.
Absolutely. So this is about, it's about assessing as far as one can at the entry point into the profession people's capacities to relate in a humane, empathetic, authoritative way with vulnerable people.
Okay, all right. Harry, we've got to get to the last question now, and probably as usual, I think, and I asked you this probably before when we talked, social workers listening to this, or even aspiring social workers listening to this, what kind of message would you like to give them about not only the work that you've been doing, but, we won't hold you to it, but the conclusions you're coming to as well?
Well, one of the things I haven't said in this discussion, or if I have said it, I don't feel I've said it enough, is just how complex social work is, and having studied home visits now for several years, I was a social worker many years ago myself, and this kind of observational research has really taken me back to just how complex the work is. You're stepping into people's lives, literally into their homes. Parents, it's not unusual for parents to be afraid, quite understandably, of the social worker's power. Social workers have to deal with a lot of resistance. There's all kinds of distractions that just as part of the way that people live, stepping into their lives, pets, dogs. A lot of social workers are fearful of dogs. Strangers in the house, trying to figure out, who is in this, who's got contact with these children, these kind of core child protection issues. And in the midst of all this, you have things that you absolutely have to do. Children have to be seen on their own. If they're young children who can't be seen on their own, then they have to be effectively engaged with alongside the parent. There's obvious things that have to be done in communicating with parents and wider family, and so on and so forth. So it's an immensely complex.
But you'd encourage people to come forward to become social workers.
Well, yeah, that's where I'm going with this. I mean, are you worried this might be putting them off, David?
Not at all.
But but I think the fact that workers can get through this, and do it in a skilled, knowledgeable way, and there is some fantastic work going on, and what I've witnessed in this research is the kind of pleasure, actually, and some of the joy that not only social workers get from doing this job well, but what families get from it. And
we don't hear enough about the good stuff.
I've had the privilege of going on visits with social workers, and the families would spontaneously tell me how much the social workers have helped them change their lives. For instance, parents whose children have been taken into care, sometimes at birth, and the children are now back at home, and the parents have said to me, we accept that the children, we weren't good enough parents for the children to be safe with us, and because of the work that social workers have done with us, within a context of other services as well, we have our children now, and we're ever so grateful to what social workers have done.
Harry Ferguson, thanks very much, and very good luck at your presentation at the BASPCAN Congress today.
Thanks very much, David.
Well, there it was, Harry Ferguson from Nottingham University. Now, as usual, my thanks to Alba Digital Media for the technical skills in helping put this podcast together and put it out. I'll be trying to bring as many good interviews as possible over the next few weeks. I'll be interviewing a senior training person from Papyrus, it's a charity who work with young people who are contemplating suicide. They have helplines, and they have a terrific amount of experience and knowledge and policies that we really should listen to. And that also will be later on interviewing Annie Hudson from the College of Social Work and seeing how that is getting on these days. And are we getting as fast developments from it that we expect? What's its successes? What's its challenges? Good stuff. So come on back soon. Thanks for listening, as always. SpeakPipe, remember you can leave your messages about the programme, one click on the website, socialworldpodcast.com. And thanks for your company.